All martial arts have their own myths, their fallacies, and their misconceptions about their own styles. This has been passed down through the years by instructors, and they don't themselves often know what these misconceptions are. We'll talk about a few of them. Stay tuned. Welcome to Shihan's Dojo. I'm Shihan Marty Husband, and we're here today to help you grow in your martial arts, or if you want to start it, how to get into it. So if you want to build up your knowledge and your martial arts skills, this is the place you should be. So jab that subscribe button and punch that bell if you haven't already, so we can notify you when new videos are coming out. We're also going to start a weekly question whereby we can discuss and comment about different ideas or things that need to be talked about. This week's question is, what misconceptions and fallacies do you see in the martial arts you're currently practicing? Put it down in the comments below. Today we're going to talk about this touchy subject of misconceptions or fallacies in the martial arts. There are many misconceptions you can find in most all martial arts, from karate to jiu-jitsu to kabuto, even kung fu. We will base this dissertation basically on karate, so we can give you what it entails so you can kind of see how we're looking at misconceptions. In Okinawa in the late 1800s, kata, basically kusanku, kankudai, basadai, they were broken down for the schools there in Okinawa, and they were basically taught, shorter versions of the katas, which are like known as pinnin katas and hien katas to the Japanese. In the 1920s, when second time Gichin Funakoshi went to Japan, he began to change and codify everything more towards the Japanese styles that were in Japan already. He basically needed to take the Okinawan Tode that he taught and give it more of a Japanese feel because of the prejudice that was still felt towards the Okinawan Islands at that point. Then even bigger changes happened after World War II was over, and people were allowed to once again practice the martial arts. Most organizations tried to turn this into a sport and keep it structured like they did in school, where they could teach the masses one particular codified system and not have to worry about it on an individual basis. This kept many of the old secret trainings and ideas away from most of the foreign people who did that, and allowed them to basically pick and choose what they were going to teach. In doing this, many of the martial arts changed and took out information that was very critical to self-defense itself. Originally, like in classical styles such as karate, there was a lot more jiu-jitsu. They took it out because they felt it was too violent for other people to handle. And in jiu-jitsu, people who were doing that basically took out the stand-up styles and became more focused like judo was. The same thing happened in aikido, where they took out several of the throws that were very dangerous and deadly and called them illegal so nobody would learn to use them and hurt somebody. These skills and training were left out, and ultimately they became the fallacies and misconceptions that were eventually enacted for different reasons. The problem did not lie in the fact that they were intended to be misconceptions, but many martial artists now have not done a deep enough study to see what has gone on in their system or what has changed. Now mind you, change is very important in everything. It includes the martial arts. However, there are always certain principles that needed to be adhered to that were overlooked. And now we have to sit back and examine these techniques and changes to see if there is any sense of realism to them or they're readily usable. Let's go over some types of physical fallacies that are taught in the martial arts. One of the first things that is often taught to beginning martial artists in karate is 5 and 3 and 1 time sparring. This is often brought up as a self-defense practice. Many of you out there understand this type of training because I'd say a good 80-90% of you out there do some sort of one-time sparring so you can test your techniques out and figure out how they're going to be used. But many of these things have created the artificial circumstance of moving backwards. The condition of stepping back was never really trained in the martial arts up until the 20s and 40s. There were a few instances that there was retreating in, but let's take a look at moving backwards. If you train a person to go backwards in real life, then they'll learn to train themselves to go in that direction. And they'll train it over 100 times, 1,000 times, but when a real life situation happens, they get caught off guard many times by that simple fact that the techniques that they were using weren't real, and as they go backwards, the opponent becomes faster and more aggressive and is able to catch up to him. That's a big problem with moving backwards in the martial arts. It makes it almost impossible for the beginning martial artist to be able to actually defend themselves. I know some of you out there might thinking, well, that's the way you should do self-defense. It's not. And if you've ever done a kata or any other type of form in the system, 98% of them never go backwards. They always go forward or to an oblique angle. That isn't to say there isn't a strategy or tactic that you can use for retreating, maybe to control or throw your opponent, but it's not necessarily done in these forms that way. Much of the bunkai that is used to explain to beginners how to use these techniques in self-defense either end up showing them how to move backwards or basically stay in a stationary position. This is far from what kata teaches us. If you followed what was in a previous video I did on the kwambu, you'll not see any movements backwards even in the practice of those sets of techniques. Yes, there are turns, and they're directional turns, not moving backwards. These techniques are used to help you understand the authentic, realistic action that it's taking. There are situations like when you turn, it's actually a throw. It's not an attack. It's not facing another opponent. It's simply to get rid of the opponent you were dealing with. As you can see in this example of Hihan Nidan here, sometimes called Pinyin Shodan in Okinawa, there are many variations of bunkai. In many of these Japanese styles, they are taught to go backwards at first without realizing what they're trying to accomplish. They're just saying go back, hold up, and they waste so much motion. Often in the Okinawan systems, you'll see them go out on an oblique angle. And sometimes that's correct, and sometimes, depending on the technique, it's not. Because, again, they tend to waste motion by teaching the beginners one little thought process at a time. Now, mind you, beginners have to learn things one at a time. But the problem then becomes, then they think the technique is farther out than it should be. This is not to say that the bunkai isn't any more correct than somebody else's bunkai, but you have to understand the realism that went into the development of the kata. The misconception then begins when the person begins to trust the technique that they've been practicing these 1,000 times or more. This false trust becomes so built up to the point that their schema will only recognize the fact of moving backwards. Without a doubt, when you really study kata, you will always see the instances where their techniques are moving forward into the attacker's line of attack and then handling it from there. When the hands are being used like that, both hands and probably one of the feet are being used in the process. And sometimes, in one movement, you're hitting somebody 5 to 6 times with just one move. You're saying, wait, hold a minute. We'll talk about that later because it is a pretty complicated technique. Sometime, if you're doing forms, sit back and examine those forms you use. Begin to question exactly what movements there are and see if they follow a normal pattern of self-defense. If it's newer forms like taekwondo forms that are made for like sporting events or even katas in karate that have been created by somebody in the past 50 years or so, if you follow the directions I was talking about in kwambu, you would understand that these directions are really the only directions you can go. Again, many of these newer katas were created to basically control the masses to make sure they're doing exactly what everybody else is doing. There's very little individuality taught to martial artists till they get way high up in level, if they're lucky. Other aspects of the martial arts that have often been misinterpreted can be as simple as a downward block. Very few people understand the difference between the parry and the strike, and if they do, they're not taught quite how to use them the right way. If you really understand, most of those blocks is always a parry followed with a strike. But many of these classical traditional styles will let beginners believe that the downward block or outward block or inward block, that those blocks at the end are actually the blocking techniques. But if you understand these techniques, many people would never be able to reach the technique before it hit them. Hence you have to look at the parry that's in between the block. I can't speak for all martial arts, of course, because I don't know them all. However, one has to sit back and examine the weaknesses and fallacies by looking at where it came from and how it was originally used and how it is interpreted today. This doesn't mean that the bunkai you're using is not correct, but you have to make sure it's not something someone made up because it looked close to the kata. There are many types of misconceptions in mental and physical ways of teaching. Once a person establishes what is fallacy, then they need to turn around and start working these bad habits out of their system. True self-defense is not built on bad habits, but exacting techniques that the masters who created them used their self-defense at that time. And they wanted to share their schema with those that they were teaching. The best way to segment it first was in the kwambus that they knew, because they turned around and implemented and created these forms using the principles of kwambu movement. If a technique's not working for you, it's obvious you should get rid of it. Or if there's some fallacy with that technique, you need to examine how it's working for you so you can be sure in a self-defense situation it works properly. Use something like I described in the tap system to figure out just how that technique is going to be applied and used. I know this has only been a brief introduction to the fallacies of the martial arts. There are many more. But in this video, we wanted to help you to start and look and understand with your own martial arts so you can learn to develop your own system around these fallacies and fix them. To build on your forms, your basics, in your self-defense, and make that self-defense a little more realistic. It's a lifetime thing. So in order to get better, yes, if you take karate, you need to take jiu-jitsu. You need to take some weapon systems. You need to cross-train and build your style, because in the end, the martial arts has to become your system of it. And that's a lot of things that some traditional karate doesn't like. They want you to look exactly like a robot. But self-defense is never determined to be like a robot. Nobody's ever going to throw a perfect punch at you in the street. They're going to do something weird. So you have to practice and do that. And that's a common misconception. If somebody's throwing a jab at your face in the martial arts, you know what's coming. But if you've ever had a real hook punch come into your face, you'll understand that it's not the same way as what they've been swinging in class. And if you step back, you're more than likely going to get clobbered by one of the two hands that'll be coming at you. Now, I want to cover some more fallacies another time, so I just kind of wanted to start a discussion here with you guys, and we could go into other fallacies that have been taught. Don't forget to comment on the question down there and give us an idea of what you feel is a common fallacy in your martial arts system. I'd love to discuss it with you guys, maybe talk about it, and see if we can work on something to help other people out there. Let us know even what you think of our videos, how we can improve them, what you need as a martial artist to succeed. We'll see you again here at Shihan's Dojo.